I am now approaching the free Gaza ship Al Auda, which is docked here in Copenhagen for a couple of days before they continue on their journey through Europe towards Gaza. Okay, so now I'm at the boat and have just met a few of the crew. Here is Zohar, who I'll be interviewing as we arranged long ago. And we have a few more crew members here. On the left is John, then we have Keith and Kit and Karen. Thank you very much. So in addition to the big Al Auda, we have two smaller boats here, Swedish boats. They will also be part of this flotilla. Here we are on the Al Auda in Copenhagen, getting ready to continue tomorrow for your sailing through the, in fact, wait, you are going
the Atlantic route.
Through the Atlantic, and those two smaller boats, they're going
well,
through...
actually the Freedom will go with us on the Atlantic route, and another small sailing boat will join the Myrid in Kiel and will do the canal route.
I see. So this this journey is going to take how long until, what is the point when you reach Gaza?
We plan to reach Gaza at the end of July.
Yeah. Have you, Zohar, been on any of these flotilla events before?
I've been part of the organization since 2012. I was supposed to be a passenger on the Spanish boat in 2011, and that's when we were stopped in Greece, so I couldn't go. And I've never actually sailed and got to the confrontation point, so I was not there.
Yeah, yeah.
So this, if we actually get there, this will be my first.
Yeah. And as we have learned from the historical trace of such flotillas, when you say confrontation point, until 2010, there have been some flotillas which managed to get through, and Israel sort of let it go. But it apparently began to be a serious PR issue for boats to actually get there. And then we had, of course, most people will remember this, the 2010 Mavi Marmara incident, which got actually nine activists of the around 600 activists killed on board, and another person was killed, was shot, got in coma, and later died. So 10 fatal casualties from the Israeli assault by commando forces on the Mavi Marmara. That was a definitive point, we could agree, relating to what the calculated risk could be, because what happened there was that the ship was intercepted in international waters, very far from Israeli waters, and that was the response. So from that time, people knew that there's a big likelihood that they would not even reach close to Gaza, that they would be intercepted in international waters, stopped there, and taken to Ashdod, Israeli port, and quite ironically be charged with entering Israel illegally and banned maybe for 10 years or whatever it is Israel does to prevent people from coming. So in a way, when we talk about these flotillas today, we are talking about a big likelihood of not getting close to Gaza, as well as a possible lethal confrontation. How do you feel and how do you think about these logical assessments?
Well, first of all, we feel that it must be done, that the fact that this the blockade, the illegal blockade of Gaza goes on, forces us to keep acting against it. And our direct action, non-violent direct action, is directed just as much towards the Palestinians of Gaza in solidarity with them as it does towards the international community, civil society, in order to put pressure on the governments of the world to actually make Israel lift the blockade. So the issue of actually getting into Gaza or being intercepted is beside the point. What we do is what we do here in Copenhagen. We just raise the issue, we explain to people what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Gaza. We explain how it's illegal according to the international law. The blockade on Gaza is used by Israel as collective punishment, which is prohibited by the Geneva Convention. So, we have to do it. We always hope that Israel will come to its senses and realize that we're not a threat to its security, that actually we work for the interest of the people who live in that region, both Jews, Muslims, Palestinians, Christians, whatever. It doesn't really matter. Everybody will benefit from better living conditions in Gaza. So the Gaza blockade has to be lifted anyway.
Yeah.
And even though we know Israel has always intercepted us in international water, and actually we have some legal cases with boats that they're trying to confiscate legally inside Israel court system. And one of the arguments they make is when you announce a blockade, you actually have the right to intercept any boat that declares it's going to break this blockade. You can intercept it anywhere, just outside the territorial water of Denmark. Basically, this is what they're saying. Whether they will practically do this, I don't think so. But this is what they claim. So we think it's very important for the people around the world to know this. This is what Israel claims to do, just like it claims that it can shoot unarmed demonstrators in Gaza with snipers, and just get away with it. So we think it's time to stop this immunity of Israel. It's about time that the world will actually listen and hold Israel accountable for what it's doing.
Let's look at the logical argument in relation to the material of what is here, because in the first flotillas, and I would say at least up to the Mavi Marmara, we were talking a lot about actual material support. That was
humanitarian aid.
Humanitarian aid, material humanitarian aid that was on board, and the experience has showed that all this is basically, it's liable to get confiscated in advance when Israel intercepts like this. So I've talked to other activists on other flotillas, and it turned out that actually, whilst there were some symbolic material aid, actually the flotillas began to become more like what you are describing, an ideological means of attracting attention, more than the question of whether you can get this solar screen over there, really expose by a kind of PR effort what is going on, like you are describing to me. Interestingly, in Israel, if you read the commentaries about, for example, the last flotilla, I think was that 2000. No, the one I covered in 2015, I think they were sort of deriding the fact that it is a PR and calling it. It's almost like calling it PR terrorism, in the sense of it's not really about material support. It's just about generating propaganda, as you see. So even Well, you talk about the PR. You talked about the protest, recent protest in Gaza, and the shooting. Last week we had in one day over 60 were killed, 60 protesters. Israel reflexively refers to this as terrorism and tries very hard to frame it as a terrorist event. So the army, for example, claimed that 24 of the 60-something killed were had documented Hamas or what was it, Al-Aqsa Brigade, whatever terrorist background. And then they even, Netanyahu even took a Hamas statement, which seems to be more propaganda than truth, that, they're saying that actually 50 people are related to Hamas, so there's 50 terrorists. And, anything that can be related to the Hamas, to the regime of Gaza, is very quickly labeled as terrorist. Even the BDS, you get Israeli officials saying it's ideological, it's economic terrorism. Even you get this from the justice minister, from different officials. So all this is Israel is also on its own propaganda crusade, you could say, to label any support to Gaza as terrorism. And I suppose that then reflects upon activists that they are being framed as terror supporters. Do you recognize this? Do you get this accusation?
Well, first of all, let me refer to what you were speaking about, like the humanitarian aid. And the truth is, the first Free Gaza movement boats that actually got into Gaza carried no aid. These were small boats, and it was an act of solidarity. They came in with international activists, and they took some people from Gaza who needed medical care or needed to reunite with their families. So, it's not always been about humanitarian aid. As the blockade went on, the need in Gaza was rising, and so people around the world said, what can we do? And the idea was to bring aid. But of course, there are loads of international agencies and NGOs that bring aid into Gaza. This is actually working for the occupier. The occupier benefits from this aid, to the Palestinians. So on the one hand, Israel oppresses the Palestinians. It doesn't let them develop their own economy. And on the other hand, they force the international community to buy aid in Israel in order to deliver it into Gaza. We go against this injustice. And what we say, what Palestine needs is justice. The name of our mission this year is the right to a just future for Palestine. Because we think there's no future the way it is, or at least it's a very unjust future. It's just not right to keep people under your boot and at the same time call them terrorists if they resist you. This goes against any common sense, and what we just try to do is counteract this Israeli propaganda that says we're delegitimizing Israel. The BDS or the direct action of the Flotilla is not delegitimizing anything. We're just exposing the reality. And what Israel does with its policy is delegitimizing its existence. This is my understanding. When I was accused by the Israeli, at the airport, they searched me and they said, you're delegitimizing Israel. And I say, it's not me. I don't do anything. I'm just, a normal person. It's Netanyahu who's making, he's calling the shots, and he's doing stuff that's going to make it impossible for the state of Israel to keep on being this, democratic Jewish state that he declares it is. So this was about what you asked about terrorism and how we're. So I don't know if this answered your question.
Well, when you are talking about the accusation of delegitimization. You got this as an actual accusation at the airport. When was this last time you?
Well, I don't often go back to Israel. I'm an Israeli citizen. I don't know if this came in the introduction.
Zohar is an Israeli citizen. Yes.
So I go back to Israel to vote in the elections. And the last time I went was in 2015. And this was the second time that I actually got stopped at the airport. You know, they take you to this little room and they just ask you questions and they get you to write down your email and your phone numbers and your addresses or whatever. And they ask you like, why did you come here? Which had never happened to me before. Normally as an Israeli citizen, you just go straight in. The second time, they did not only question me,
when was the first time?
The first time was 2013.
Yeah.
And the second time, they handed me this notification that I had to present in a police station in Tel Aviv. So I said, you know, what's that? And they said, you know, you just talk to this name. So I went there, and it was the Secret Service. It was Shabbat thing. And, you know, they just try, you know, they sent out feelers. They didn't accuse me of anything. They said, we know what you're doing. We would like to know why. We would like to speak to you about this. And, of course, you know, it wasn't in my interest. I said, if you're not accusing me of anything, I'm not going to say anything. Everything we do is public. It's on the web. Yeah. If you're going to accuse me of something, I want a lawyer here.
Yeah. So they flagged you already, at least back in 2013, for the civil activity that you do. And what do you think specifically it was, your involvement in the Free Gaza movement? Or?
Yes, I'm almost sure that this is what she told me, this woman who was questioning me. She said, we know you're involved in the organization of this. And I really think that it's my obligation as an Israeli and as a person of Jewish origin, you know, being raised on this heritage of the Holocaust. I come from a kibbutz where most founders were from Hungary, Holocaust survivors. I grew up with these stories all around me, and I say this is the lesson we have to learn from the Holocaust. We cannot be silent when such terrible things are happening. If we know about them, we have to act. Like we complain about the world being silent during the Second World War, we cannot be silent now. So this is my way of doing something. And I, as an Israeli, I gave up on trying to change it from the inside. I live in Spain, so I tried to, you know, become part of a group that was actually doing something. And I found that direction actually was good. I'm also, you know, in contact with people who are with the BDS movement, and I think they're compatible. I think it's very important, as you know, to raise awareness, to make it clear to the world that we cannot treat Israel as a normal state when the situation inside it is something that, you know, European citizens would not accept for themselves.
I want to go back to the delegitimization notion. I think it's really important to get the notion of what this is all about ideologically and how Israel construes the terrorism notion about the BDS. You said it was, they said to you that you are involved in delegitimization. Now, we have seen recently that a law has been enacted and a list has been published of some 20 organizations who are banned from entering Israel, and this even includes an organization like Jewish Voice for Peace, which involves Jews who, you know, it's a historical issue, you could say, for the Jewish state, because by the Israel's law of return, any Jew anywhere is actually a potential automatic citizen, like is welcomed with open arms. It doesn't matter where you are. That's the law of return. You'll get citizenship, you'll get a welcome package, you'll get help from the government and all. Now, it seems that things are changing somewhat because certain Jews, specifically Jewish organizations, if they are critical and if they support BDS, which is, as I mentioned, labeled kind of terrorist organization in some way and manner, because it is involved in the so-called delegitimization of Israel and so-called economic terrorism and so on and so forth, they are now, even Jewish people, being banned from coming. So this is a quite high-profile thing. Not to mention other organizations like the Quaker organization, who actually helped. They are recognized internationally as and historically as having helped Jews in the Holocaust. He spoke about the Holocaust. They are also banned because they have also been involved in divestments and support of the BDS. So somehow things are moving. Jews used to be a protected group as far as the Jewish state was concerned, more or less. Like, you wouldn't ban a Jew. But now there's the right kind of Jews and the wrong kind of Jews too. Still, you are you and me, by the way, I'm also an Israeli citizen. We are in another group that is already of Israeli citizenship. So we're not just talking about Jews who are potentially citizens, but Jews who are already Israeli citizens. Now we can see that there is even a flagging, and I wouldn't call it a crackdown as such, not overt, but a flagging and a certain sensing of what can be, how these people can be limited, even if they are Israeli Jewish citizens. So somehow it seems that the tide is going in the direction of, it won't be a question of whether you are Jewish or not. It will be a question of whether you support the Israeli policy, and if not, well, they haven't denied you entry, but if you were on this flotilla and you were not an Israeli citizen, then if you were intercepted and as we experienced, taken to Ashdod and accused with illegal entry,
would you be deported?
You would be deported and probably denied entry, like for 10 years. We have, for example, interesting example of Dror Feiler here in Sweden. He lives in Stockholm, and he was on Gaza flotillas, and he gave up his Israeli citizenship long ago. Actually, as I understood, it was more because he wasn't allowed to have dual citizenship. He decided to have Swedish citizenship. But he's a former Israeli Jewish citizen with a mother in kibbutz very close to my old kibbutz. And he can't visit her. He was banned for 10 years. But this is not still not happening to people like you and me. It's of course speculation, but do you think it is going in this direction too?
I think the Israeli society is experiencing something other societies under regimes that are getting more and more entrenched in their auto justification of what they're doing. It's getting less and less tolerant to criticism from within or from without. So I hear people who tell me that they read Haaretz and they're sort of, their neighbors start looking at them and say, this is really not on. What are you doing? And I'm just thinking about Germany in the 1930s. And, to me, this is where the Israeli society is going. So I don't know what they'll do with me. They could accuse me of treason or whatever. I don't know, because it's also, what would serve their purpose. Like, they don't want us to get any publicity. So, I don't know what they'll do. But I'm really worried about this trend in the Israeli society where everything is twisted. I just read today about the demonstrations in Haifa against the shooting in Gaza, and the demonstrators say, we just say Arabs and Jews don't want to be enemies, and our opponents say yes to killing, and then we're portrayed as supporting terrorism, and they're portrayed as, really tolerant. I think, this is all really like George Orwell's 1984. It's all back talk, double talk, whatever. And
Newspeak.
Newspeak. Yeah, that's it. So it is really worrying for me, and I don't know what the motivations of all the people on this boat are. I think most of them are just good people who can see justice and remain silent. But to me, it's a very personal thing. I see my society. I see that it's going through a pathological process, and I'm just worried. And I think we have to do something. As Israelis, we have double or triple obligation to counteract this terrible process.
Do you think that something has changed recently? Because we've had a massive we had a massacre. We had a series of massacres related to the Great March of Return. I'm saying a series of massacres because I noticed that the media is now tending to isolate on one day, one incident. That's important too. One day with over 60 deaths in a civil protest, that's important. But there's also just a touch bigger perspective of the Great March of Return, which was over like a few weeks. If you count the deaths there, we're talking about around 110. And there's obviously the much bigger perspective. But concerning this last week's massacre at the culmination of the Great March of Return, and that was on the Nakba Day, 15th of May. And incidentally, or probably not incidentally, on the same day when USA was celebrating with Israel the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, and many outlets noticed also the dichotomy between these two events, like people in the finest of dress over there, and you could hear a pin drop, total quiet, and then at the same time, Benjamin Netanyahu, even Haaretz did this little video. It's a great day for Israel, Netanyahu says, day of celebration, and then they show the shootings in Gaza. So there has been it has been noted as a particularly egregious massacre, and there have been several Israeli scholars. They wrote an open letter. It came out, I saw in the Guardian. Nurit Peled El-Hanan, Avram Burg, and others calling for an investigation. In fact, last Friday, the UN Human Rights Council decided, despite Israeli attempts to block it, decided to launch a probe investigation, inquiry into what happened, and they have about a month to do it. So now, when all this happens, those scholars that I mentioned, they were mentioning Sharpeville. The parallel of the 1960 apartheid South Africa Sharpeville massacre. I wrote about it, incidentally, the same day, and then I noticed also their comparison, and there have been others who have noted it. When you say Sharpeville, when you make that parallel, that comparison, you're basically saying, you're pointing to an event that was not only significant, but central, seen as central for the starting of the reversal of a tide towards relinquishment of apartheid. Nelson Mandela in 1996 used Sharpeville as the location for the declaration of the new South African Constitution. It's symbolic. In Sharpeville, just to say shortly, we're talking about there were maybe 5,000 to 7,000 more or less protesters against the pass laws, which limited freedom of movement, and it ended at the middle of the day with a massacre of, I can't now remember the numbers. There were about 280 something casualties, out of which, 68, I believe, it was 68 dead. So even in numbers, we have a quite striking similarity, although when you look at the Israeli casualties, we're up in the thousands, but never mind. The importance of this is that calling it a defining moment. So obviously now we had this massacre in Gaza, and some are saying that's a defining moment. And obviously Israeli Hasbara is working incessantly now to frame this as protecting our borders at any price. I said there's a New York Times opinion now by Shmuel Rosner defending Israel has the right to defend its borders by any means necessary. And do you think that this is a defining moment? I mean, from the moment, let's say 2 months ago, when you were planning this flotilla, do you think this is a different flotilla than it was when you planned it?
Well, we've actually been planning this flotilla ever since the last mission, which you couldn't remember, but the last mission was in 2016. And it was
16.
Women's boat to Gaza. There was one in 2015 that left from Greece, but actually the boat left from Sweden. But we've been planning this one since 2016. We knew in advance, of course, that 2018 will be the 70th anniversary of the Nakba. We couldn't foresee, but it was also not very surprising that the occupation and the blockade will still be present in 2018. So we actually did not plan this in the last 2 months. We knew even before that the boat will be called Alauda. It wasn't something that we made on the spur of the moment when we heard about the Great March of Return. This was planned. It had nothing to do with us. We supported, of course, but it had nothing to do with us. So ours is a solidarity, international solidarity movement with the Palestinians of Gaza and with the Palestinians in general. But to say whether this is a defining moment, I think on the one hand, yes, and on the other hand, Israel has been practicing a targeted assassination for, I don't know, at least 10 years, if not more, right?
Targeted assassination?
Yeah.
You mean specifically Gaza?
Not just Gaza. Like any person who's suspected of terrorist activities is subject to, just Israel coming and dropping a bomb on their house and killing a lot of innocent people at the same time.
Oh yeah, Israel has been practicing targeted assassination for ages.
Yes.
I mean, we just had, I don't know if you read this, but Ronen Bergman, he published a new book about Israel's targeted assassinations amongst else. And, we're talking about the 80s and trying to get Arafat and planning to blow up a whole stadium or maybe down an airliner, civil airliner, to get him. I mean, Israel has been doing this forever. Yeah. But what are you talking about?
Yeah, so this is just an acceleration of the same process. And when they say, actually, those people we killed were Hamas activists, so we didn't kill them for participating in the whatever activity they were doing, whether they was throwing stones or, as journalists just taking pictures. It doesn't matter what they were doing at the same moment. We have the record, and we're the judge, and we're the executor, because Israel doesn't have the death penalty yet, only for like Nazis or something. But soldiers have this capacity to act as a judge and execute, basically. So it's not a culmination even, because we don't know where we will end. We always think this is the worst it can get, and then it gets worse. Yeah. Where's the bottom for this moral degradation or whatever,
Abyss.
Yes. So what I'm trying to get at is, I really think Israel is acting as a wounded beast. And I think in a way, the Great March of Return, especially the non-violent aspect of it is a threat. It's a threat to the Israel ethos of, we are here and we have a right, but, they know that with what happened in 48, they began this, long descent to where we are now and where we'll still be going. And I think people have this tendency to want to be the good guys, so we have to convince ourselves that we're the good guys, we're the most moral army in the world, right? So we don't do war crimes is not what we do. We have to convince ourselves of that as Israelis. But if these masses of non-violent, unarmed people just walked towards the fence and they declared, we will not try to break the fence by force, we will not try to go into Israel, but we walk and we sit in the tents because we've had enough. We think that 70 years after the Nakba is enough, and we need the world to recognize our right to return, recognize the right to return, not an actual return, but recognize it. And if Israel has a Nakba law that says you can't even mention it, even though since that law, the word has become like, common, much more common than before. But it's something at the heart, it's like the original sin. And it's coming to the surface. And this is why Israel is acting like this wounded beast. And it's actually threatened, the existence of Israel, because of our own actions throughout all of the history of the Zionist movement. Unfortunately, we've come to this point where it's actually nearly impossible for a Jewish state to exist in Palestine.
It's interesting that I'd like to catch a word you said, dissent, when you talked about 1948 and now. And it's really interesting, well, you said the history of targeted assassinations, it's not new, but even, and I pointed this out in one of my articles about the Great March of Return, that even in the very paradigm we're talking about, how refugees are considered infiltrators, this even has a history in the very, very first years of Israel. If we look at, for example, Benny Morris, Israeli historian, wrote the book about Israel's border wars, and between in the early 50s, his assessment is that Israel was shooting between, I remember, 2,700 and 5,000 Palestinians who were just expelled. And he says most of these people, they were of course called infiltrators, terrorists, but that most of these people, he actually says, like, about 95% of those people were not even coming with any kind of military intention. They were coming for social, economic reasons, trying to see their home, maybe pick their fruits, stuff like that. And Israel treated it as infiltration. I would say it's a very, very long history related to this return. But when we're speaking of the March of Return, do you think that this idea of return is what does it for a lot of Israelis? I mean, conceptually, because for many Israelis, and I'm not just talking about right-wing Israelis, I'm talking about Zionists in general, the idea of return is just anathema to Zionism, because of the logic that potentially, it's the same logic that started, that brought the ethnic cleansing in 1948. The logic that if you are, well, Benny Morris said it too, is like you're trying to make a Jewish state in a place where, which is by majority Arab, and a Jewish state cannot exist unless it entails the expulsion or the transfer, he calls it, of the vast majority of the population. So it's the same logic. It's still with us here today. So the notion of return for Zionists is kind of like parallel to destruction, and it's even sometimes said explicitly, this is destruction. So, do you think that just the fact that it's called the March of Return, and that this notion is now said openly, this is what we are talking about, return, that this does it, that this manages to override and make people blind to what is actually being done on the ground in terms of shooting unarmed protesters?
My take on this is that it's partly subconscious, like even, as you said, the Zionist ideology cannot conceive of, a majority of Palestinians inside whatever state construction there is. I think the origins of the Zionist movement also had voices in it that said, we don't really need a Jewish state. We need a place where Jews can be safe. And if Jews were willing to live with, integrated in Palestine or in whatever other place in the world, just be integrated in a constructive way with their environment, they could be safe. The Zionist movement has taken a turn that made this impossible. So it's not safe. It's not safe for Jews to live in Israel. But this is exactly what the threat of the March of Return is not a threat to the actual existence, but it's a threat ideologically, like it could bring the destruction of this myth that the Zionist ideology has of the existence of Jews as people living in coexistence or coexisting with Palestinians in that region. So this is really the problem. And what I hear from people that they say, but we can't just let them march on our fences. And you say they didn't even get to march and to come. They didn't even try to come. And Israel has been trying to carry this situation into a battlefield terms, but the Palestinians don't cooperate. Okay, there was stone throwing, there was burning of tires to make some smoke so that the snipers couldn't actually see what they were doing, and there was some kites, right? Some kites with something, and there was actually one from the Israeli side that came back and burned a field. But it's not a physical threat. It's a subconscious thing. So, and the fact that it's non-violent is making it more difficult to confront. So Israel is using, I think, the snipers, trying to instigate the Palestinian, the people control, because it's Hamas, but they have actually made some sort of a reconciliation with the Palestinian Authority. So, whoever it is, just trying to instigate them to, throw a rocket here and there, and then Bibi will have his war, and he could, get away from whatever corruption charges he has.
It's interesting. Well, I would say, to be fair, there are, and Israel makes a big point of this, of showing that there has been an explosive device here and an attempt, a few militants with guns there, and to show the purpose of these is relatively isolated and almost negligible incidents is to show that all of this is basically one big pack, and those are the instigators of it, those are the heads of it, but there's a big snake there, and it's all part of it. So when Israel is here about, there was actual militants there, or the fence was there was an explosion here, it's enough to say, well, potentially, all those people could have been running over the fence and so on. We've also seen a case of, some people got through the fence and then they celebrated with some flags and went back. I mean, we know that in the practical application of thousands and thousands of people entering. This is not really a practicality for the Palestinian return as such, but it's got this symbolism, and I'm thinking, these people who are coming hundreds. Sometimes I'm not even mentioning the journalists, and I'm not even mentioning the medics who got shot and so on. Treating and people just hundreds of meters from the fence, or maybe even 100, whatever it is. They are, in a way, they are showing Israel. We're here. We're not going to back off to the invisible 1,000 meters or whatever so that you can't see us. We are actually here. And if you're going to shoot us, people are going to see that. This visibility, I would say that this kind of flotilla carries this mission to create this visibility. Israel cannot help reacting to it, although it tries to sort of do it in a way that won't harm its own PR, it always ends up shooting itself in the leg. And then it becomes a competition of who was more right, and whether we have the right to defend our borders. But Israel has had a real kind of PR debacle. Norman Finkelstein has talked about it a lot in relation to the Mavi Marmara, and looking back at 2006. Because in 2006 Israel was fighting the second Lebanon war against Hezbollah, and it was a major defeat. Actually, it was a big. It was not a success for Israel, and it was losing what is called the deterrence force. Finkelstein is talking about the Marmara incident also in this respect, in terms of that it wasn't just about stopping the ship. It was about creating deterrence for people not to do it. And Israel has this dual consideration. On the one hand, it tries to create the deterrence. On the other hand, it worries that creating the deterrence will not look bad. As they say, photograph bad. And now the IDF spokesperson a few days ago, he said that actually the problem is that the Palestinians are like winning by a knockout, because our shooting so many Palestinians is not, it's not photographing well. There was said the same about the use of white phosphorus in 2014, that it didn't photograph well. 2008,
2009, the phosphorus.
What, am I getting it wrong?
The Castle.
Oh,
well, anyway.
Yes, I'm sorry. But I think it was 2014 that they were saying that we're not doing it because it doesn't photograph well. But you're probably right. You're probably right. Yes, you are right. It was 2008.
Yeah, they stopped using it because it wasn't, they use other things.
First they denied that they use it, and then they said we use it but for smoke, and then okay, but then it doesn't photograph well. Okay, so there's always this consideration of the PR issue.
And of course, they're right. What we try to do is a media stunt, of course. And yeah, maybe we are provocators. And I think the fact that Israel used lethal force and unproportional violence on the first flotilla made the second flotilla a lot more powerful. A lot of people all over the world were saying, we have to do it again.
You mean after the Mavi Marmara?
Yes, the 2010 flotilla. It was the Mavi Marmara was just one of 8 boats that composed that flotilla. So there was a lot of force, and so Israel used another tactic and stopped us in Greece, and that didn't work because some of us, even though we were stuck in Greece, we said we have to go on doing this. And we try to be inventive because the media gets tired of us as well. It's just not interesting anymore. Just like it's not interesting that people in Gaza die a slow death by suffocation. basically economic, and it's exactly as you said. It's so much easier for Israel and for the rest of the world to have them, invisible. All these poor people in Gaza, but it's always the same. It doesn't change. So yeah, maybe we give some money for aid, but we don't really want to solve the problem from its root. And it's because Israel has been successful, at least inside Israel, but also I think internationally, in making the Palestinian people invisible. And then there's this group in Gaza who are our partners, called We Are Not Numbers, who just try to say, don't just count the dead and the wounded. We are people. We all have, even the martyrs have names, but it's basically the people who are alive and they have their stories. And if you can relate to that, and this is what we're trying to do, we're trying to put a human face on the suffering and injustice of the illegal blockade and of the Palestinian situation under occupation in general. To say these are people. Ahed Tamimi has been very successful, has been a face, a symbol, but there's 500 other children or minors in Israeli jails. I'm not sure about the number, but it's in the hundreds. Yeah, and there's different situations in Palestine. There's Hebron, which is held, and there's all the area C, and people being sort of like pushed off their land by restriction on building and water rights and everything has to do also with the denial of right of movement. So the fact that we're sailing is actually to show that we can sail, they can sail. There's I don't know, hundreds, thousands of refugees drowning in the Mediterranean all the time. Gaza people are not even given the right to try and sail to drown in the Mediterranean. So this is why we can sail, so we sail. And if it's PR problem for Israel, at least a PR problem, then we're doing our job.
Yeah. This may be the difference if we talked about 1948, the whole 70-year paradigm. Maybe this is the difference that defines what happens now as opposed to what happened in 1948. I mean, people had, there were cameras in 1948, but it's not the same. It's not. We probably wouldn't have this situation going on in 1948, and people didn't walk around with mobile phones in 1948. So we didn't get a whole big series of photos of how Israeli soldiers were shooting unarmed Palestinian refugees. We have it from later scrutiny of classified documents and so on. It takes a lot of time. Now we are seeing things more immediately. It's, in a way, it's very sad, the whole visibility issue, even today, because I mean, we have seen, even though Israel doesn't let journalists, even Israeli journalists, enter Gaza, then still we have seen massive onslaughts of Gaza. 2008, 9, we've seen 2012, that was a little bit smaller, but 2014, I mean, in 2008, 9, people were saying, you can't do this again, like it can't get worse. Got 2014, it was worse. We have seen this, like, even though you had, like, for example, Christian Armanpour from CNN from a hill inside Israel overlooking the bombings in Gaza, in a way it affects, it should have effect. Even though you're not in there, you can see the clouds of smoke. But somehow it seems that Israel is managing to reduce the visual effect by closing off Gaza more. And I think it was Oren Ziv from Active Stills, the photographer, who recently wrote an article in Plus 972, I think, about how how Israeli journalists have to rely upon, other than what they can see, to deduce what happens in Gaza and how this is limiting. It ends up with that the military and the government have a lot of effect upon the narrative, because you get what the IDF spokesman says, and then if someone says something and they are protesters inside Gaza, oh, they're just protesters, so they get, who's going to believe that, in a way, and this is also part of the closing off. So it's very sad that even though we've had those, whole families obliterated, but it's like, I can't remember who said this, it's like you can, a journalist, you can see the explosion, but you can't see the blood. And now that I can get the logic, it's a very sad and cruel logic, that these protesters from the March of Return, they want to get to an area of visibility, that we will finally see them beyond the fence, even if it's 300 meters, that we will see a little person over there. And it's almost, it's a debt they're paying, literally paying with their lives to become visible. I cannot express to you my disgust about the people who say that they don't care about their lives because they know. It's like Thomas Friedman from New York Times. They should know that Hamas is telling them to get near the border. They should know that they would be shot. What's going on with these people? Yeah, it's because their level of desperation is such that actually some people are willing to do it. Sometimes you don't even have to be near the border. You can be a baby inhaling tear gas at the tent. You don't actually have to be anywhere near the fence to die. But so it has become the mission in relation to Gaza, and it's even using Norman Finkelstein's term, it's martyrdom. It has become the issue to make it visible. I suppose you share this desperation of making it visible, and this is what you are actually doing here. You are hoping but actually expecting not to reach the shores of Gaza, and yet what you are doing on this very boat is trying to make it visible.
Exactly that. It's unfortunate, but it seems like, media will not pay attention unless you actually do something. So we're just a bunch of people, normal people, from all walks of life, from, 10 or 12 different countries, just trying to do something, basically to save our own conscience. But, what will you say to the next generation? What did you do when Gaza was dying? What did you do when Palestine was suffering and being so invisible? And it's breaking the media blockade that's our biggest challenge. That whether we get to actually break the physical blockade on Gaza is sort of secondary. And this is why we're doing all these interviews and hope that the word will get out there. And actually coming into Copenhagen yesterday, just seeing all the people who see us, and maybe something will click. We are suffering in this age of overdose of information, and it's so difficult to see what you don't want to see. That sometimes when a boat just passes by and you see this flag, well, it makes you wonder why these people are doing that. So this is what we're trying to do, and this is why the journey is so much more important than the destination.
And with those fine words, Zohar, I want to thank you very much for this interview, and I wish you all the best and stay safe. Thank you very much for what you're doing.